The planet was remote, far from the busy corridors of civilization. On this lonely world, a human exploration team was making its way through dense forests. The lead medical officer, a man of practical experience, was navigating the rugged terrain when something strange caught his eye. The sky, which had been clear just moments ago, seemed to shimmer with an eerie glow. Suddenly, a loud noise split the air, followed by a burst of flames that lit up the forest for a brief moment. He froze, instinctively reaching for his communicator. "Captain, there's something." He didn't finish the sentence. Instead, his focus shifted completely to the burning object that had just fallen from the sky. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. A sleek, metallic craft spiraling downward in a fiery descent. His heart raced as the sound of the crash echoed through the trees. Without waiting for orders, he rushed toward the wreckage. The officer, his training kicking in, ran through the thick underbrush, knowing that whoever was inside that ship needed immediate help. As he reached the wreckage, the fire had begun to subside, leaving behind a smoldering heap of twisted metal. He scanned the area, looking for survivors, and it didn't take long before he spotted something, or someone, lying near the wreckage. It was an alien, but not just any alien. The figure was humanoid in shape, with pale skin and striking features. Long, silvery hair spread out across the ground, and a trail of dark blood marked the path she had fallen. The officer rushed to her side. She was unconscious, breathing shallowly. Her injuries were severe, and his immediate medical training took over. "Stay with me," he muttered to himself, assessing the situation quickly. Her pulse was weak, but it was still there. He checked for broken bones, burns, and any other signs of internal damage. There was no time to waste. He carefully lifted her into his arms, trying to make sure not to jostle her fragile body too much. His mind raced as he carried her toward his camp. He was far from his team, but there was an emergency medical station not too far from here. His communicator was broken from the crash, so he had no choice but to rely on his own skills. The officer didn't stop to think about the risks. His only focus was saving the life of this strange creature. When he reached the camp, he laid her gently on the medical table, his heart pounding. The officer knew he was dealing with something entirely new, and that alone sent a wave of dread through him. Who was she? Why had her ship crashed on a planet so far from any known system? And most importantly, how was he going to save her? Working quickly, he began to tend to her wounds. His medical kit was standard for humans, designed for his species' needs, but he would make it work. He applied painkillers, began a series of basic life-saving procedures, and stabilized her condition. He wasn't sure how long it would take for her to wake up, but he had done all he could for now. Exhausted, the officer leaned back in his chair and stared at the alien, whose face was pale but serene in sleep. Despite the language barrier, despite the unknown surrounding this situation, something inside him urged him to help her. He wasn't just doing his duty, he was doing what felt right. Hours later, the princess stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, then slowly opened, revealing a striking pair of violet eyes that seemed to see right through him. The officer stood up and stepped closer. He was careful to keep his distance, not sure what reaction to expect. When she saw him, her eyes widened slightly, though there was no sign of fear, just confusion. "Where am I?" Her voice was weak, but clear. Her accent was strange, unlike anything the officer had ever heard. He looked into her eyes, trying to assess if she would panic. "You're safe now," he said softly. "You're on a human research base. You were injured in a crash. I found you and brought you here to treat your wounds." She blinked a few times, processing his words. "Human," she repeated, as if testing the sound of the word. "You are human." "Yes," the officer replied cautiously. "And you're from a different world, aren't you?" The alien nodded slightly, her face grimacing in pain as she tried to sit up. The officer quickly reached out to steady her. "Rest," he said, gently pressing her back down. You're still recovering. The princess hesitated for a moment before speaking again. I owe you my life, human, she said, her voice soft, yet full of gratitude. The officer didn't respond right away. There were still too many questions. Who was she? How had her ship ended up here? And why was she so important that her life mattered to him? Someone from a completely different species. Before he could say anything, she spoke again, her voice quieter now. I am the daughter of a king, and I must return home. The officer looked down at her, uncertain how to respond. Was she royalty? What did that mean for him, and what would happen next? For now, all he could do was wait for answers, and hope that he had made the right decision in helping her. The medical officer sat by the table, his eyes fixed on the injured alien princess as she rested. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the medical equipment around them. The officer had done all he could to stabilize her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this situation than he understood. Who was she? And why had she been so far from her home world? He glanced at the small window overlooking the forest, the same forest where he had found her. The night was dark, and the trees whispered in the wind. He took a deep breath, trying to push away his doubts. For now, the only thing that mattered was making sure she survived. Hours later, the princess stirred. Her breathing became more regular, and the pale blue light of the medical monitor shifted. Slowly, she opened her eyes. At first, she blinked in confusion, her violet irises scanning the room. She seemed disoriented, her gaze moving from the ceiling to the officer sitting by her side. Where am I? Her voice was quiet, but clear. There was an unfamiliar accent to her words, but the officer could tell she was trying to focus. You're safe, he said, his tone soft but reassuring. You're on a human base. You were injured. I brought you here to help you recover. The princess's eyes widened slightly as she processed the information. She slowly turned her head to look at the officer more closely, studying him. Her expression was one of both curiosity and caution, but there was no sign of fear. That was surprising to him. He had expected more panic or confusion from an alien who had just been rescued by a human. I remember the crash, she whispered, her voice faint. But why are you here? You're human. The officer nodded, a little surprised by the question. Yes, I'm human. I found you after your ship crashed. You were unconscious, and I treated your injuries. She frowned as if the idea of a human helping her was difficult to grasp. A human. Saved me. He nodded again. Yes. You were badly hurt, but you're going to be fine now. The princess fell silent for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the ceiling as if deep in thought. She had long, silvery hair that framed her face and delicate features, but there was a strength in her eyes that couldn't be ignored. Despite her injuries, there was an undeniable nobility about her. My name is Silara, she said quietly. I am the daughter of the king of Zorathar. The officer raised an eyebrow. The name sounded unfamiliar, but he didn't press her for details. There was enough mystery surrounding this situation as it was. Silara, he repeated. That's a beautiful name. I'm glad you're awake. She managed a weak smile before her expression became more serious. You said, you are human. Where are we? We're on a research base, he explained. You crashed on this planet. It's a remote world, far from the main systems. I'm part of an exploration team sent to study this area. She took a deep breath and winced slightly as she shifted in the bed. Her injuries were still painful, but they were no longer life-threatening. The officer could see the weariness in her eyes as she adjusted to her new surroundings. It was clear she didn't belong here, on a small human research base, far from her home world, injured and alone. The situation was starting to make less sense by the minute. How long have I been here? Silara asked, still trying to process everything. 2 days, the officer replied. I've been keeping an eye on you, making sure you were stable. Silara's brow furrowed as she thought for a moment. 2 days, she whispered, almost as if speaking to herself. I must return home. My people need me. The officer's curiosity deepened. What do you mean? Why is it so urgent? Celara's gaze darkened, and the officer could sense the weight of her words before she even spoke. I am not just anyone, she said softly, her voice steady but with an edge of sadness. I am the heir to the throne of Zorithar. My father is the king, and my people, they are at war. They need me to lead. The officer was stunned. He had known she was important. Her regal bearing had made that clear. But this was a different level of responsibility. She was royalty, and from the sound of it, her situation was much more dangerous than he could have imagined. And your ship? He asked. What happened to it? It was shot down, she replied, her voice tight. We were ambushed by an enemy fleet. I don't know how many survived. She paused, her eyes distant, as if she was reliving the moment. I was supposed to meet with allies, but now I don't know if I'll make it back. My people could already be in danger. The officer felt a surge of empathy for her. Despite everything she was going through, Celara's primary concern was for her people, her planet. He had never seen someone so committed to their duty, especially not someone so young. But he also knew this wasn't something he could fix alone. Is there anything I can do? He asked. Celara turned her gaze to him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and determination. You've already done more than I could have asked. You saved my life. But now, I need to get home. I need to return to Zorithar. The officer hesitated. Helping her get home would not be easy. He had no idea how to navigate the political landscape of her world or the dangers she faced. But one thing was clear. His role in this story wasn't over. He had chosen to help her, and now he couldn't turn back. I'll help you, he said firmly. We'll get you back to your people. Celara smiled weakly, though her eyes were still filled with concern. Thank you, she whispered. And in that moment, the officer realized he was about to become part of a story much bigger than he could ever have imagined. The officer stood in the small room, the hum of the medical equipment still a steady reminder of the hours he had spent making sure Celara was stable. It had been 2 days since he had found her on a crash site, and in that time, everything about the situation had changed. She wasn't just an alien from another planet. She was royalty, the daughter of a king, and the heir to a throne that seemed to be on the brink of war. And now she was asking for his help to return home. After their conversation, the officer had spent the next few hours thinking carefully about what to do. He had never been trained for situations like this. Helping someone from another world, let alone royalty, wasn't something he had ever expected. But the determination in Celara's eyes was undeniable. She needed to get home, and if he could help her, he would. It was clear that her planet, Zorithar, was in danger. If she didn't return soon, her people might face defeat. And with the princess in such a fragile state, she couldn't travel alone. The officer felt the weight of the decision pressing on him. He had to go with her. But there were still so many unknowns. You're sure about this? He asked, turning to Celara, who was sitting up in the medical bed, her face set in a determined expression. She nodded slowly, her silvery hair falling around her face. I have no choice. I need to go back. My people are depending on me. Her eyes were full of both strength and worry. I trust you, human. You saved my life. Now, I must return the favor. The officer hesitated. There were so many reasons why this was a bad idea. Zorithar was far away, and he had no way of knowing what dangers lay between him and her home. He wasn't even sure how to navigate the intergalactic politics involved. But her words stuck with him. She trusted him, and he couldn't let that trust go unanswered. He made up his mind. We'll leave at first light, the officer said, but we need to be careful. We'll need to keep a low profile and figure out the best way to get to Zorithar. We can't afford to attract attention. Celara nodded, though her face was still lined with worry. I know. I'll need to speak to my people. They must know I am alive. The officer nodded. The situation was complicated, and he couldn't afford to rush it. They needed a plan, something that would get them to Zorathar safely and quickly. The following morning, the officer and Solara prepared to leave the base. It was clear that the first part of the journey was going to be the hardest. The base had limited supplies, and they needed to figure out a way to leave without drawing attention. The officer packed his gear, making sure he had enough medical supplies, weapons, and tools to make it through the unknowns ahead. But he also had to consider Solara's needs. She wasn't fully recovered yet, and though she was determined to go, he could see that the trip ahead wouldn't be easy for her. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked her one last time, his eyes full of concern. He could tell she was trying to hide the pain in her face, but it was still there, a lingering reminder of how fragile she truly was. "I'll be fine," Solara said, her voice steady. She straightened up, as if to prove she was strong enough to handle what came next. "We have no time to waste." With a nod, the officer grabbed his bag and slung it over his shoulder. He turned toward the door, and Solara followed. They had no way of knowing what lay ahead, but they had to try. The first leg of their journey took them through dense forests and rugged terrain. The officer led the way, using his skills to navigate the landscape while keeping an eye out for any dangers. The planet was beautiful, but it was also unpredictable. They needed to get to a nearby landing zone where an old transport ship was hidden, one that the officer had used for similar missions in the past. As they walked, Solara remained quiet, her face occasionally clouded with worry. The officer noticed her unease and offered her a reassuring glance. "You're doing great," he said. Solara looked up at him, her expression softening. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." He wasn't sure what to say. He had never imagined that he would end up in a situation like this, helping an alien princess get back to her war-torn planet. But there was something about Solara's determination that made him feel like he was doing the right thing. They reached the landing zone by mid-afternoon. The transport ship was hidden in a small valley, surrounded by rocks and trees. It was an old model, but it had been well maintained. The officer had always preferred using smaller, less noticeable ships for missions like this. He keyed in the code to unlock the ship's hatch, and the doors slid open with a soft hiss. "This is where the real journey begins," the officer said, glancing over at Solara. She nodded, taking a deep breath before stepping aboard the ship. She looked around the small cockpit with a sense of awe, her gaze flicking over the controls and the ship's unfamiliar layout. The officer had to remind himself that, while she was royalty, she wasn't used to space travel in the same way humans were. The officer set the ship's course, and soon they were soaring through the skies, leaving the planet behind. As the ground below them grew smaller, the officer felt a sense of unease. They had no idea what awaited them. Would they make it to Zorathar? And if they did, would they find allies, or would they be walking into a trap? Solara stood beside him, her hands gripping the console with quiet determination. "We will get there," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "My people are counting on me." The officer nodded, knowing that no matter what came next, he was in this until the end. Together, they would face whatever dangers awaited them, and whatever secrets lay hidden within the stars. The ship glided silently through the dark expanse of space, the stars outside flickering like distant candles. Inside, the officer and Solara were surrounded by the soft hum of the transport's engines as it made its way toward Zorathar. The trip had only just begun, and though they had been moving for hours, neither of them spoke much. The officer focused on the ship's controls, constantly monitoring their course, while Solara sat quietly, her violet eyes lost in thought. Every so often, Solara would glance out the small window beside her, her face a mix of hope and worry. She had told the officer that she was heir to a throne, but the officer had no way of knowing what awaited them. Would her people welcome her back, or had too much time passed? Would the war have taken its toll on Zorathar in her absence? The officer couldn't stop thinking about the risks involved in this mission. They were on their own, with no backup, no allies, and no way to communicate with anyone who could help. If something went wrong, there would be no one to turn to. But he also couldn't ignore the deep feeling that they had to succeed. Silara had trusted him, and he had already committed to helping her. There was no turning back. After a while, the officer glanced over at her. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "Is everything okay?" Silara turned to him, her face softening. "I'm just thinking," she said, her voice calm. "I never imagined that one day a human would be the one to help me. My people are so different from yours, but you've shown kindness when no one else would." The officer smiled faintly, though it was hard to tell if he truly felt like he was doing anything special. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a hand when you needed it." Silara shook her head, her silvery hair catching the light. "No, you saved me. Without you, I would have died on that planet." The officer didn't reply. He knew she was right, but it felt strange to hear it spoken so openly. The alien princess, someone so different from him, was placing her life in his hands, but he couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility toward her. He had made a promise, and he wasn't about to break it. Hours passed, and as they drifted deeper into space, the stars seemed to shift and move faster, as if they were entering a different part of the galaxy. The officer continued to monitor the ship's navigation, his eyes scanning the readings on the control panel. "According to the data, we should be nearing the edge of Zorathar's system," the officer said after a while, his voice low. "We'll be in range of their planet in less than an hour." Silara's eyes narrowed, her fingers tightening around the edge of the console. "What do we do if we're intercepted?" The officer's lips tightened in a grim line. "We fight if we have to. But we have to be careful. Zorathar is a war zone, and their enemies will be looking for any chance to attack." Silara nodded, understanding the stakes. "Then we make sure we're ready." As the ship approached the planet's atmosphere, the officer's nerves began to tighten. He had prepared for a smooth journey, but nothing about this mission felt certain. The last thing they needed was to be spotted before they reached the surface. He adjusted the ship's course to make it less noticeable, taking every precaution to avoid detection. But he knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. Zorathar had a powerful military, and if their sensors picked up an unidentified vessel, they would be found. The atmosphere grew denser as they neared the planet's surface, and the ship began to shake slightly from the friction of entry. Silara gripped the seat, her face tense but focused. "Hold on," the officer said, his voice calm despite the increasing turbulence. "We'll make it through." The ship continued to shake, and for a moment, it felt as though they might lose control. But then, as quickly as it had started, the turbulence stopped, and they broke through the atmosphere into the planet's lower orbit. The officer let out a slow breath, relieved that they had made it this far. "We're clear," he said. "Now we need to find a safe place to land." Silara nodded. "I know a place, an old outpost. It's not far from here, hidden deep in the mountains. My people used it as a safe house during the early days of the war." The officer's eyes met hers, his expression serious. "Is it safe?" "For now. We'll be able to regroup there and figure out what to do next." The officer set the ship's course toward the outpost. As they flew over the rugged terrain of Zorathar, the officer could see signs of destruction. Burned cities, ruined buildings, and miles of barren land. The war was taking its toll on the planet, and the sight only deepened his concern for Silara and her people. This wasn't just about getting her home. It was about ensuring she had a chance to help rebuild her world. The ship descended slowly toward the hidden outpost, nestled in a mountain range far from the war zones. The officer could see the small structure emerging through the clouds, barely visible against the jagged cliffs. They were close. "I'll take over from here," the officer said, his hands moving quickly over the controls as he prepared for the landing. As the ship touched down, the officer and Silara both breathed a sigh of relief. The landing was smooth, and the small base they had come to was silent. Isolated, just as Silara had said. But even though they had reached this safe place, there was still much to be done. The real challenge was just beginning. Silera turned to the officer. "We're here. Now, we need to find out what's left of my people, and we need to figure out how to end this war." The officer nodded. The journey to Zorathar had been long, but their mission was far from over. As they prepared to step into the unknown, both of them knew that the road ahead would be filled with dangers. But they were ready. Together, they would face whatever challenges Zorathar had to offer. The small ship settled quietly onto the rocky ground of the outpost. The sky above was darkening, casting long shadows across the mountains. The officer looked out through the cockpit window, his gaze fixed on the surrounding wilderness. Zorathar was a beautiful planet, but it had been scared by war. The destruction they had passed on the way here was only a glimpse of the chaos that raged below. Silera stood up first, her expression calm but determined. She had been silent during the descent, her thoughts far away. The officer followed her out of the ship, making sure to keep an eye on the surroundings. The outpost was small but well hidden, tucked between jagged peaks, and it seemed safe for now. But he knew better than to let his guard down. "Are you sure this place is secure?" he asked, his voice low. Silera nodded, though her eyes seemed distant. "For now. My people used this as a secret base before everything fell apart. It should still be safe." The officer wasn't sure how much he could trust that. Zorathar had changed since Silera had been gone, and he could sense the unease in her voice. But there was no other choice. They needed to regroup, plan their next move, and figure out how to contact Silera's people. They made their way inside the outpost, a small structure with weathered walls and a few scattered supplies. The lights flickered on as they entered, and the officer couldn't help but notice how empty it felt. There were no signs of life, just dust-covered furniture and abandoned equipment. It was like a forgotten place, left behind in the wake of war. Silera seemed to read his thoughts. "It was abandoned quickly," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "When my people started losing ground, they had to leave in a hurry. We never had the chance to reclaim it." The officer nodded, his mind racing. They were so close to finding out what had happened to Zorathar, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. If Silera's people had been defeated so thoroughly, what chance did they have now? "I'm going to check the communications equipment," the officer said, breaking the silence. "We need to get in touch with someone, find out what's happening." Silera didn't argue. She simply nodded and went to the far side of the room, where a small table was set up with maps and old data pads. She started going through them, looking for any clues or information that could help. The officer moved toward the communication console, his fingers flying over the controls. The equipment was old, but it could still work if he could get it to function. As he worked, the silence in the room grew heavier. There was something about it, something unsettling. The officer couldn't put his finger on it, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to ignore. It was as if something was waiting just outside, lurking in the shadows. Finally, after several tense minutes, the communication panel flickered to life. A faint signal came through, static filling the air. "This is Captain Drake," a voice crackled through the speaker. "Who is this?" The officer's heart raced as he adjusted the frequency, clearing the static. "This is Officer Hawkins, human. I'm with Princess Silera of Zorathar. We need assistance." There was a long pause before the voice replied. "Princess Silera. Is she alive?" Silera turned sharply at the mention of her name, her face a mixture of hope and disbelief. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "I'm here." The voice on the other end sounded almost relieved. "We thought you were dead. After the attack, everything fell apart. We've been fighting a losing battle ever since." "Where are you?" the officer asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "We need to meet. My ship is hidden nearby." "We're in the capital ruins. It's a dangerous place now, but we have a small group holding out. It's not much, but it's all we've got." "Understood. We'll be there soon," the officer said, before cutting the connection. Sellara looked at him, her eyes wide with relief. There are still survivors. We might have a chance. The officer didn't share her optimism. He was relieved, yes, but there was still so much they didn't know. The capital had been a battleground for years, and if the enemy was still in control, they'd be walking straight into the heart of the war. But he knew one thing for certain. They couldn't stay hidden forever. If they were going to turn the tide, they needed to find out what was happening on the ground. He grabbed his pack, checking the contents one last time. We'll leave as soon as possible. We don't have much time. They made their way back outside, the cold air biting at their skin. The mountains loomed above them, a silent reminder of the war that had ravaged the planet. As they approached the ship, the officer glanced over at Sellara. She looked different now, more determined, as if a fire had been reignited within her. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice soft but full of gratitude. "For everything. You didn't have to help me." The officer gave a small nod. "I'm not in this for thanks. We're in this together. Let's finish what we started." The two of them boarded the ship, and with the course set, they took off into the sky once more. As they flew over the ruined landscape of Zorathar, the officer couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far bigger than either of them could handle. But they had no choice. This was the only chance they had. And whatever came next, they would face it head-on. As the ship soared toward the capital, Selara's voice broke through the tension. "The enemy is stronger than we thought. But we have to try. For Zorathar." The officer nodded. "We'll make it through. Together." The mission was only just beginning, but for the first time, he felt a sense of hope rising in his chest. Whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. The ship soared through the thick clouds, cutting through the atmosphere of Zorathar with a sense of purpose. Below, the capital city, once a thriving hub of life, lay in ruins. Broken buildings, smoke rising from craters, and the remains of once grand structures were now a testament to the war that had torn the planet apart. Sellara sat quietly next to the officer, her eyes fixed on the view outside the window. She had lived here once, in this very city. It was where her father had ruled, where she had been raised in luxury and safety. Now it felt like a distant memory, a dream lost to time. The devastation below was hard to bear, but it was a reality she had to face. She couldn't undo what had happened, but she could help change the future. "Are you ready for this?" the officer asked quietly, glancing at her. He could see the mixture of determination and sadness in her expression. She had been through so much already, and yet it seemed like the hardest part was still ahead. Sellara didn't look at him. Instead, her gaze remained focused on the destruction below. "I have no choice," she said softly. "My people need me. I can't just hide away anymore. I have to do whatever it takes." The officer nodded, understanding her resolve. "We'll stick together, no matter what happens." For a moment, they both sat in silence, the hum of the ship the only sound as it cut through the air. The journey to the capital had been swift, but there was no mistaking the danger that awaited them. The closer they got, the more tense the atmosphere became. They were entering a war zone, and the risks were higher than ever. As they approached the ruined city, the officer took the controls, carefully navigating the ship toward a hidden spot near the edge of the capital. He'd studied the area before, and he knew of a safe place to land. But even that was a gamble. They had to move quickly and stay under the radar. "We're almost there," the officer said. "Stay low. We don't want to be seen." Sellara nodded, her face steely with determination. She was no longer the princess who had been rescued from the wreckage. She was a leader, ready to do whatever it took to save her people. Her heart ached for the city below, but she couldn't let emotion cloud her judgment. There was too much at stake. The ship descended slowly, skimming the rooftops of ruined buildings until they reached a small, hidden square surrounded by shattered walls. The officer carefully landed the ship, making sure it was out of sight from any potential enemies. The engines hummed softly as the ship came to a complete stop. "We'll have to move fast," the officer said. "Once we step out of this ship, we'll be in enemy territory. They'll have eyes everywhere." Solara nodded, standing up and moving toward the exit. She was ready. This was her moment, the moment she had been waiting for since the day she was forced to flee her home. The officer followed her, his hand resting on the sidearm holstered at his waist. They had no idea what they would find in the capital, but they were ready to face it. As they stepped out into the ruins, the smell of smoke and decay filled the air. The once proud streets of the capital were now silent, haunted by the remnants of a lost civilization. It was hard to imagine that this had once been a place of power, a city that had stood as the heart of Zorithar. Solara's eyes scanned the area, her senses alert for any movement. She had lived here, but everything had changed. The city was unrecognizable. The soldiers who had once guarded the streets were gone, replaced by the remnants of a resistance group that still fought for survival. "Where do we go from here?" the officer asked, his voice low. "There's a hidden safe house nearby," Solara said. "My father used to meet with allies there before the war spread too far. It's the last place we can go to find out what's really happening. The resistance is still holding out there." The officer nodded, ready to move. "Lead the way." The two of them moved quickly through the ruined streets, staying in the shadows and avoiding the open areas where they might be spotted. The officer had been trained for situations like this, moving in and out of dangerous areas without being detected. But this was different. Zorithar had once been a peaceful world, and now it was a battleground. Every corner held the potential for danger. As they moved deeper into the city, the officer kept an eye on the surroundings. He noticed the faintest movement up ahead, a shadow shifting in the debris. His hand instinctively went to his weapon, but before he could react, Solara put a hand on his arm. "Wait," she whispered. "It's them." From the shadows, a small group of figures emerged, moving cautiously toward them. They were dressed in worn-out clothes, their faces hardened from the years of conflict. These were the people who had survived, the ones who had refused to give up on Zorithar. The officer kept his hand on his weapon, but Solara stepped forward, her face softening. "Are you the resistance?" she asked, her voice clear and steady. The leader of the group, a tall man with a weathered face, nodded. "We are. And you're the princess." Solara's heart skipped a beat. For a moment, she was unsure of how to react. These people had thought she was dead, and yet here she was, standing before them. She couldn't afford to show any weakness. Not now. "I'm alive," she said firmly, "and I'm here to help." The resistance leader studied her for a moment before nodding. "We've been waiting for you. Your people need you. The war, it's worse than we thought. But together, we can fight back." The officer stood beside Solara, his hand still on his weapon. He didn't know what to expect next, but he knew one thing. This was only the beginning. The real battle was about to start, and there was no turning back. "Let's go," the officer said. "We have a world to save." And with that, they followed the resistance group into the heart of the capital, ready to face whatever came next. The air in the capital city was thick with tension as Solara and the officer followed the resistance group through the ruined streets. Their footsteps echoed in the emptiness, the only sound breaking the oppressive silence of the destroyed city. Above them, the once proud spires of the royal palace loomed like a shadow, a symbol of everything that had been lost. But the resistance was here, and so was Solara. Together, they would fight to reclaim what had been taken. They arrived at the hidden safe house, a small building tucked away beneath the remnants of a collapsed building. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the weight of desperation and hope. The resistance fighters had set up makeshift beds and equipment, preparing for the next phase of the struggle. Solara stood still for a moment as she looked around. She had been here before, but now everything was different. The people who had once served her father were now scattered, tired, and broken. The war had taken everything from them, but they had survived. and they had not given up. "Welcome back, Princess," the leader of the resistance said, stepping forward. His face was lined with age and hardship, but his eyes held a spark of determination. "We thought you were lost forever." "I was," Solara said, her voice steady. "But I'm back now, and I'm here to finish this." The officer stood quietly by her side, his hand resting on the hilt of his weapon. He had been through many battles, but this was different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about standing up for something much bigger. They were fighting for a future, for a world that had been ravaged by war. The officer knew it wouldn't be easy, but he had made a promise. He would see this through to the end. "What's the situation?" the officer asked, breaking the silence. The resistance leader's face hardened. "The enemy has taken control of the capital, and they're preparing for an assault on the rest of the planet. We've been holding out here, but we don't have much time. If we don't act soon, the war will be lost." Solara's eyes narrowed. "Then we strike now. We can't wait any longer." The officer watched her closely. She had always been a princess, but now, in this moment, she had become something more. She was a leader, a symbol of hope for her people. He could see it in her eyes, the resolve, the strength. It was what had driven her to survive all this time, and it was what would drive her to victory. "We need a plan," the officer said. "We can't go in blind." The resistance leader nodded. "We've gathered intel on the enemy's movements. They've been amassing troops near the palace. If we can get to the palace and take out their command center, we might be able to cripple their forces." Solara stepped forward. "I know that palace. I've been there. I can lead us in." The officer's eyes met hers. He trusted her, but this was dangerous. The palace was the heart of the enemy's operation. If they failed, it would be the end. "We need to be quick," the officer said. "And we need to be ready for anything." The resistance fighters nodded, each one steeling themselves for the battle ahead. They had been waiting for this moment for years, and now it was here. They weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for their future. As the group prepared to leave, Solara turned to the officer. "Thank you for everything," she said, her voice soft but full of meaning. The officer gave her a small nod. "You don't need to thank me. We're in this together." With the plan in place, the group set out toward the palace, moving swiftly through the streets. The capital was eerily quiet now, the sounds of war muffled by the stillness. The enemy's forces were everywhere, but they were hidden in the shadows, waiting. The officer kept his senses sharp, always on alert. The last thing they needed was an ambush. As they neared the palace, the tension grew. The once grand building stood tall against the skyline, its walls scarred by years of conflict. Solara's heart raced as they approached the gates. This was the place where everything had started, where her father had ruled, and where she had been forced to flee. "We'll enter through the back," the resistance leader said, pointing to a narrow alley. "It's less guarded." The officer and Solara led the way, their movements swift and precise. They'd reached the back of the palace without being detected, and the officer carefully opened the door. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the grand halls silent and abandoned. But they couldn't stop now. The enemy was close, and they needed to strike before it was too late. As they moved through the palace, the officer felt a strange sense of déjà vu. He had seen places like this before, once proud structures now reduced to ruins. But this was different. This was Solara's home, and it was where the fate of her world would be decided. They'd reached the command center, the large room filled with monitors and equipment. The enemy soldiers were gathered inside, their backs to the door. The resistance fighters moved quickly, silently taking them down one by one. The officer and Solara moved in, their eyes focused on the central control panel. "Now," the officer said, his voice low, "we take control." Solara stepped forward, her hand hovering over the control panel. She had been trained in the ways of leadership, but this was a different kind of battle. This was personal. She pressed the button, and the lights in the command center flickered. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Then the building shook as explosions rocked the palace. The officer's heart raced, and he grabbed Silora's arm. "We have to move," he said urgently. "Now." They sprinted out of the room, the sound of gunfire ringing in their ears. The battle was far from over, but they had dealt a crippling blow to the enemy. The resistance had the upper hand now, and with Silora leading them, there was hope for the future. As they made their way back to the safe house, the officer glanced over at Silora. She was tired, but there was a fire in her eyes, a fire that had been reignited. "We're not done yet," she said, her voice filled with determination. "This is just the beginning." And as they prepared for the next phase of the war, the officer knew one thing for sure: they would fight until the very end. Together, they would save Zorathar.